Rarely will you do DOM manipulation because we will eventually do React जहां नहीं होती है, but पता होना चाहिए. इंटरव्यू में पूछ सकते हैं what does query selector do. All of them let you select things. मतलब if I have to quick
files from the GitHub repository. I already have mine here. And then let's open up this folder. So that's this one. And let's start by taking a look at the files that we have here. First up, we have the prettier configuration. So exactly the one that we used in the editor setup section. And from now on, we will always use. So in this section, we're going to make JavaScript interact with a web page for the very first time. And the technical term for that is doing DOM manipulation. Now, in the last lecture, you already selected an element from a page. And what that means is that you kind of interacted with the DOM already. So in this lecture, let's learn what the DOM actually is and how it works. So what is the DOM actually? Well, DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it is basically a structured representation of HTML documents. The DOM allows us to use JavaScript to access HTML elements and styles in order to manipulate them. For example, we will be able to change text, to change HTML attributes, and also to change CSS styles from our JavaScript. So we can say that the DOM is basically a connection point between HTML documents and JavaScript code. Now, the DOM is automatically created by the browser as soon as the HTML page loads, and it's stored in a tree structure like this one. In this tree, each HTML element is one object. And so let's now take a look at this DOM structure in a little bit more detail. And to illustrate this, here is a very simple HTML document, and here is what the DOM tree corresponding to this HTML looks like. So, as I already mentioned, this is a tree structure, which looks a bit like a family tree, right? And actually, we use the terms child element, parent element, sibling element, and so on when we talk about the DOM tree and DOM manipulation. Anyway, as you can see, for each element in the HTML, there is one element node in the DOM tree, and we can access and interact with each of these nodes using JavaScript. Okay, so the DOM always starts with the document object right at the very top. And document is a special object that we have access to in JavaScript. And this object serves as an entry point into the DOM. Remember how you used document.querySelector in the last lecture to select an element? So that means that the querySelector method is available on the document object. And so that's why we say that document is the entry point to the DOM, because we need it to start selecting elements. All right, then the first child element of document is usually the HTML element, because that's usually the root element in all HTML documents. Next, HTML usually has two child elements, head and body. And so, of course, you can also find them here in the DOM tree. In the HTML, they are adjacent elements, and so they are siblings in our DOM as well. Then, as we keep going deeper into the nested HTML structure, we keep adding more and more children to the DOM tree. So inside head and body, you have more child elements, and the two sections in the body even have child elements themselves. And from there, it goes even deeper, because the first paragraph also has a child, which is this link element here. And with that, finally, we have all our HTML elements in the DOM tree. But the DOM tree actually has more than just element nodes. It also has nodes for all the text itself, comments, and other stuff. Because basically, the rule is that whatever is in the HTML document also has to be in the DOM. And so, as you see, the DOM really is a complete representation of the HTML document, so that we can manipulate it in complex ways. And with this, you should now have a good overview of how the DOM works and what it looks like. But before we finish, I need to clarify something that many beginners find confusing. So many people believe that the DOM and all the methods and properties that we can use to manipulate the DOM, such as document.querySelector and lots of other stuff, are actually part of JavaScript. However, this is not the case. Remember that JavaScript is actually just a dialect of the ECMAScript specification, and all this DOM-related stuff is simply not in there. So up until this point, we have only used the JavaScript language itself. But starting in this section, we will also use JavaScript in the browser. I mean, sure, we have used Google Chrome to run our code in the developer console, but that's not what I mean here. What I mean is to manipulate web pages that are actually displayed and rendered in the browser, just like any normal website that you know. Okay, but now you might ask, if the DOM is not a part of the JavaScript language, then how does this all work? Well, the DOM and DOM methods are actually part of something called the web APIs. So the web APIs are like libraries that browsers implement and that we can access from our JavaScript code. And API stands for Application Programming Interface, but more about that later. For now, what you need to know is that web APIs are basically libraries that are also written in JavaScript and that are automatically available for us to use. So all this happens behind the scenes. We don't have to import or do anything, okay? And there's actually an official DOM specification that browsers implement, which is the reason why DOM manipulation works the same in all browsers. Now, besides the DOM, there are actually a ton more web APIs, such as timers, the fetch API, and many more. Again, we will learn a lot more about this later on. For now, let's finally start our project and do some DOM manipulation in practice. Now that we have a better understanding of what DOM and DOM manipulation are, let's now actually select and manipulate some more elements. So in the previous lecture, we already selected this message element here by using querySelector, right? Then we also got the text content from the selected element. But besides getting the text content, we can also set the content of the element. So let's do that. So instead of start guessing, let's say like correct number. So that's actually going to be like the winning phrase. So again, we select the element. So querySelector. And the same selector. So again, the element with the class of message. And then again, text content. So that's logged the result to the content to something else, want the new content to be. So let's say party emoji. But again, you don't need it, basically. And so now if I save this, it should immediately change. This thing happened, but that's because I'm here on the demo version. So I need the real one. And so here you see now correct number. Great, so that worked. And down here we still have to start guessing because that's what the content of the element used to be before. So in this line we started by reading the content of the element. And so at the beginning it was still start guessing because that's what is written here in the HTML element in the beginning, right? Then in the next line we changed it. And now if we would attempt to read it again, this line here really quick, give it a save. And so now you see that of course after changing the text content, when we then read it, it will be this new content. So exactly what we have now here. Okay, that makes sense. And so what we did here is really already DOM manipulation because in fact here we manipulated the text. So let's now do the same with this secret number and also the score. So both of these values, so this secret number here, so this here is basically this div element here with the class number. And then the score, as you see here down here from this 20, this is where this 20 is. And in this case, it is this span element with the class score. So now let's go ahead and select the elements with the class number and exactly what we did before, something dot score. And by the way, they're all the value. And when actually I'm forgetting the element to say that the text content should be logo. It's 13 and 10 now. Great, that's amazing. So do 13, so way more than just the content. So I really have to say there's way more than just the content, the entire element, because the element has way more than just the content. So I really have to say that the text content should be 13. So text content, and now as I reload this, this should be 13 and this 20. Let's actually set this to another number, otherwise we wouldn't see it changing. And indeed, we get 13 and 10 now. Great, that's amazing. So doing some great DOM manipulation here, and now let's move on and do the same actually with this input field. So an input field, as the name says, is where we can input some data. And so actually we can also get the data from here, and we can of course also set it. So let's just see how it works, and it's very similar. So as always, we start by selecting the element. And now we need to get the class name of this element. And so guess, and as I said, one argument. The value property. And so let's lock that to the console actually. So again, using the CL snippet. And if we reload this now, there is that. So as if we had written it ourselves. So we can delete it here, just like over here. The one and the down through. Now we first get to the console whenever we clicked on this button. Well, that's taking it to a whole new level. And so handling the click of a button is what we're going to learn in the next video. Let's now make our application actually do something when we click on the check button. So this is going to be the first time that our code reacts to something that happens in the DOM. And for that, we need to use an event listener. Now, an event is something that happens on the page. For example, a mouse click, or a mouse moving, or a key press, or many other events. Then, with an event listener, we can wait for a certain event to happen and then react to it. So let's try it out now. And let's actually start by getting rid of this code, because this has actually nothing yet to do with the up step, where the event should happen. And in this case, we want to listen to the event on this interested in. So query selector, or actually have two class names. The one that we are interested in is just the check class. So again, the dot for the class selector, and then check. And so this will select will event using the method. We first need to pass in the type of the event. First argument, we click event. And we do that by defining a function. And that function will contain exactly the code that should be executed whenever it's going to be called is a special kind of function. That's because as a second argument, it expects this event handler function that we just talked about. So again, here as a second argument, we now need to pass in a function value as an argument. And that's probably quite confusing, I know, but that's no problem at this point. This will make more sense as we do this over and over again. This value. And to start, what we want to happen is to simply lock and to attach an event handler. And that event handler is this function here. Okay, so this is again just a function expression. So it's similar to when we do just, for example, this, and then just log something to the console. So this is also just a function value, right? And then we can assign that to a variable, and then we call it. Usually always is a string. So let me show that to you here now. So again, we use the type of operator that we already learned before. And now I'm going to put so any value that is here in this condition part will always get evaluated to a Boolean. And so since let's now continue building our game and actually implement the game logic itself. And with game logic, I basically mean number that we just call. I implemented a solution like so the DOM actually also includes CSS styles. And so with DOM manipulation, okay, so that should happen here in this scenario where the player wins the game. And so in JavaScript, all these property names, open it up again. And the number that I'm looking for currently has a width style property. And then on there is where we specify the CSS property. And we need to specify the property in the camel. All right, so let's now implement the last missing functionality in our game, which is the high scores. And to really understand how the high score should work in this game, let's take a look at the demo again. So let's reload the game, and let's start here. And so you see that the score starts at 19. So let's try a couple of times, do a low score. Okay, so correct number, the score is 10, and the high score is now also set to 10, because this was my first game, and so now this is also my new high score. But now as I play again, my score is of course reset to 20, but now if I do a better score than this 10 here, then that will become my new high score. Okay, and that is going to happen as soon as I win the game. So let's play again. Lower. Welcome back. Let's now start working on project number 2 of this section. And in this small project, we're going to build our first UI component. And that is this modal window that we can see here by opening, or by clicking actually, on one of these buttons. So I'm sure you've seen this kind of component all over the place when visiting web pages. And so it's simply this window here basically, and this overlay, which gets overlaid over the rest of the page, right? So no matter which of these 3 buttons we click, it will always open this modal window. And to close this window, as you already saw, we can either click this button here, or we can click outside of the window. So basically on this overlay. And again, I'm sure that you've seen this functionality when visiting other web pages. So that worked as well. And finally, we can also close this window by hitting the escape key on our keyboard, like this. Okay? And this is actually very simple and very easy to build. Probably way easier than it looks like, but it will still be very useful to learn how to work in class, okay? Now here on the left side, I still have the code from the previous project open, and that's because I wanted to show you how to close the live server. So let's go back to the terminal. And so as we hit new terminal, it actually creates a new terminal. So if we want to go to the first one that was already running, we need to go here to this menu here, and then number 1, which is this note. So to change this now, we hit Control C, and that's even Control on a Mac. So it's not Command C, it is Control C. And I guess on Windows, it's going to be the same. But if it's not, you can just click this trash can here, and that will also then kill the terminal. So as I hit Control C, the process has finished, and so the live server is no longer running. So if I come here to this URL, so this localhost URL plus the current port, so the new one, 3 in its own. Modal is document.querySelector with the class modal. Now we want overlay and then close modal. So overlay, and of course we could give these to class with this class name. So let me show you what, because we want multiple element dot modal. So to actually see this, we need to again clear this console, and then all you have to do is to type live server, hit enter, and here we go. So this is our modal window now. And this one we can now close. And actually it has the exact same URL. So it's always this 120. So if we reload one of them, and yet, because as you know, we have no look at the console. Yeah. And now here we get null for some reason. So it means that it could not select anything here for this selector. And so let's take a look. Yeah, actually it is fixed that if you took a more this button here selected. However, as you can see, it is only the first one. Okay. And so now we see the limitation of our query selector method here, selector. And so here we need another one. But that's a pretty obvious name, but it's going to do the job. So as I save now you see that we get something called a node list here. So let me open that, and now as I hover, you see that these are actually all of our 3 buttons, okay? So this node list here is a little bit like an array. It's not exactly like an array, but here for now, it works as though it will do all of these with them. So let's actually do this to do something node list and do something with them. So let's actually quickly do that, node list and do something with them. So let's through this node list and do all of these buttons, then we can simply loop through this node list and do something with them. So let's actually quickly do that. So we will now again use the for loop, which again, open modal, because it saved the file. But yeah, anyway, each of these here is one element. And so now on each of it in the last project, the 3 text contents for all the 3 buttons. And here you might have noticed that I didn't even use the curly braces to define a block. And that's because, just like in an if-else statement, if there's only one line of code that I want to execute, I actually don't have to create this. That's the one. This working class. In this case, all we did was to log their text content to the console. But in the future, we will then be able to do real stuff using this technique. Okay, and that's it for this video. In the next one, we will actually already make this modal window work. Let's now actually learn how to manipulate classes with JavaScript. But the first thing that we have to do is to actually react to a click on each of these buttons here. So right now, of course, nothing happens. And so now we need to attach an event handler to each of these three buttons. Now we finished the last video by learning how we can do something for all of these three buttons at the same time, right? So for that, we used a for loop, which loops over this node list, which is basically an array holding all of the buttons. And so this button's open modal is called event listener. So let's say add the so just as I explained multiple times already. Okay, so what we want to do is to take the modal, so this element that we selected here previously, right? So we selected it and then stored it into this variable. And so now we take that selected element, and on there we can read the class list property. So that's class list. And then this class list property itself has a couple of methods. And the one we're going to use now is remove. And as I just explained, the class that we're going to remove is the class called hidden. Okay, and we can actually also remove multiple classes. For that, we just have to pass them in with commas like this. So here we then can specify more classes. Just keep in mind that we do not use the dot here. So not like this, okay? And I'm telling you that because I used to do that mistake myself and I remember that. And so I want you to avoid it. So the dot is only for the selector. But here we are not anymore selecting anything. We're just passing in the name of the class. And so all we need is a string with that name, okay? Now besides removing classes, we can also add classes, and we can even check if an element contains a certain class or not. And we will use all of them in this video and the next one, okay? And this should actually already do the trick. So when I save this now, and let's click here, and it worked. Great. So the hidden class is now gone, and I can show that to you here using the inspect. And then we need to give it some more space back. And then you see here the modal class that used to be here is no longer there. Now we can of course not close it because that functionality is not yet there, but at least and if we want it to be visible, we would set it to display block. Okay, so this would do the exact same thing, but you can see that it's a bit more of a pain because then we would have to memorize what exactly we have to write here. So the exact property name and the exact value. And this is only for one style. Imagine that the hidden class actually had 10 properties. Then we would have to write all of these properties here manually and change all their values. So that's a lot of work and it's not fun. And so instead we can basically aggregate all of these properties. Then please call this function that we just specify here. All right. And so this is our code and it's a lot better. And so actually we just did some refactoring here. And so restructuring our code without changing the functionality. And so that means that our code should still work the same. And indeed it does. We can open and close in two ways, and we can open it on all of the three buttons. Beautiful. That's really, really great. So to recap, if you want to use the same function in multiple event listeners, then you need to specify that function as a separate function, like this one here. And then you can pass that function as an argument to multiple add event listener methods. So just like we did it here, right? So that's one of the takeaways of this video of element aggregation. And so that's going to be the topic of the next video, along with learning how to actually deal with a key press event. So that's yet another really exciting video. So let's now check that out. So each class functions a bit like a container with a lot of properties in it. And then here, by adding and removing them, we basically can activate and deactivate certain styles all at the same time. Okay, so keep that in mind, and even better, actually write notes maybe with what I'm saying, because this is really important stuff. So working with classes is something that we do all the time. And there is a third thing that we do with classes, which is to check if a class is actually present on a certain element. And so that's going to be the topic of the next video, along with learning how to actually deal with a key press event. So that's yet another really exciting video. So let's now check that out. Let's now learn how to handle key press events. So right now, we can already close the modal by clicking the close button and by clicking outside of the modal. But usually, there's also a third way, and that's by hitting the escape key on the keyboard, right? And so this is actually a great use case to learn how to respond to keyboard events. So in order to listen for keyboard events, we still need to use add event listener because the key press event is simply just another type of event. Now, keyboard events are so-called global events because they do not happen on one specific element. And for global events like keyboard events, we usually listen on the whole document. So let's close this terminal here. And now let's write document. So that's the same document that we use for query selector. And so basically it's a big object which contains a bunch of methods for all kinds of stuff. And that includes the add event listener method. So by using add event listener here on the document, we are basically listening for events everywhere. So no matter where they happen on the page, they will always trigger the event handler that we're going to specify here. All right. Now here about the name of the event itself, there are actually three types of events for the keyboard. There is the key down, the key press, or the key up. Key up, which is, so it's this one. This one only happens when we lift our finger off the keyboard, basically, or off the key. Key press is fired continuously as we keep our finger on a certain key. And key down is fired as soon as we just keep our finger press or the key up. Key up itself, there are actually three types of events for the keyboard. There is the key down, the key press, or the key up. Key up, which is, so it's this one. This one only happens when we lift our finger off the keyboard, basically, or off the key. Key press is fired continuously as we keep our finger on a certain key. And key down is fired as soon as we just press down the key. And so usually that is the one that we use. Okay, so the name of this event is just key down, and this event will happen as soon as we hit any key on the keyboard. Okay, and then just like before, we specify a function here. And this time let's specify it here directly. And here, a key press that happens. So let me, what? Pressed. It doesn't matter which one. So Q, 3, P, enter, ask, any key, just renders here the same message. However, we only want to close the pop-up when the escape key was pressed. Okay, so that key we need waiting for that event to happen. Well, what we need to do is to give this function here a parameter, and let's take a look at it. So as you see, the information about the key, I was always getting it from this key property. So let's just log e.key. Hit the escape key. So now you see ask was pressed. All right. So it does not contain the hidden class, right? And so here we can once more invert that Boolean value. So you see enter, and now it's having just small second project. So once again, I hope you like this one, and I hope you can start to see the power of DOM manipulation so that in the future you will be able to build anything you can imagine just with JavaScript. Now that is of course still a long way to go, but that's also why we have the next project, which is going to be a really nice project to basically train and reinforce most of the things that we already did in this project and the previous one. So the next project is going to be more like a practice project, but I still believe it's very important to do that project in case you have the time. And believe me, it's by far the most exciting thing we have done yet in this course. Welcome back to project number 3 of this section. And this project is going to be the most exciting one, because now we will take everything that we learned in the first 2 projects to a whole new level and build a really cool and and amazing game. And this is the game that I was talking about, and it's called the Pig Game. Now, this project here is really going to be a practice project. So a project where you and me will together reinforce all the skills that you have learned up until this point. Because remember from the last section, reinforcing knowledge is one of the most important things that you can do to learn, right? So in this project, I will do a little bit less explaining than before, at least about the stuff that we already learned, because we are really just practicing here, okay? Now, if you're in a hurry and just want to learn the basics, please feel free to skip this project. But of course, I would still really advise.
As I was saying, someone mentioned it correctly. We should have done DOM before, but doesn't really matter. We can actually do DOM pehle bhi. Actually, that might be a better thing to do, but it's just very simple. HTML, CSS, just, yeah. Sorry guys, surprise, we're not doing backend today. Let's do this first. Let's finish DOM, help us practice a little more JavaScript, and then next week let's do backend. Let's not do intro to HTTP today. We will do DOM, which is a sort of a mild prerequisite to React. So just to give a high level context, until now it's I think week 6 or 7. So for the first week 1 to 5 weeks, what have we done? We have understood the basics of JS. We have understood async JS, and you know that Lupe website, if you remember. All right, hi everyone. Talking via messaging, instant messaging, or IM. Talking via emails, accessing an algorithm that is only available in one big machine, let's say at a HTTP. Wahan pe the port would be 80. Request you can send not just the domain, but also a route, also a method. And similarly, payload section will let me describe. No, just tell the backend, kya this is my email and this is my password. Now you could have totally done it over here, /sarkirat@gmail.com/123123. But of course, it looks so ugly, right? Compared to this. Kya alag se body mein maine bhej diya. We have seen examples of this also. If I go to the body section. In HTTP communication, the body or the payload refers to the part of an HTTP message that contains the actual data being sent to the server. All right, we begin in a bit. How's everyone doing? Things now we have also covered request headers, the sum for them, a plus b, and return them the sum. Question is, how do you send them back the sum? How do you send them back the sum of two numbers? It's as simple as rest index.html you can change, and that change will reflect immediately. Backend answer contains your key. So ये कितना साफ नहीं है compared to one thing that we have done, which is slightly bad over here. Not very bad, very slightly bad, is there is some code duplication here. Request count plus plus यहाँ डाल दिया. And also it's a little ugly. कि यार multiply की पहली चीज क्या होगी? Request count plus plus. Multiply का real business logic is coming. What does this one line of code do? It says user.find, and then there is a function inside. It's very similar to user.map. That user will go to the sign-in page. .js. जहां पे मैं एक common middleware बना दूंगा that will do the authentication checks. So, function auth middleware. Do you remember how to write middlewares? There is a request or a hello. And इस organization के members are, let's say, person number 2. करी थी क्या मैंने? Storage organization that we will create, उसका admin ID we will give to the Raman's user ID, which was 2 in this case, क्योंकि he was the second user. Rather than pushing, I need to delete. And one way to delete is कि यार members array now looks something like this. ID, whatever, user.id is not equal to this thing. Something like this. Members will now, as I was saying, someone mentioned it correctly. We should have done DOM before, but doesn't really matter. We can actually do DOM pehle bhi. Actually, that might be a better thing to do, but it's just very simple. HTML, CSS, yeah. Sorry guys, surprise, we're not doing backend today. Let's do this first. Let's finish DOM, help us practice a little more JavaScript, and then next week let's do backend. Let's not do intro to HTTP today. We will do DOM, which is a sort of a mild prerequisite to React. So just to give a high level context, until now, it's I think week 6 or 7. So for the first week, 1 to 5 weeks, what have we done? We've understood the basics of JS. We have understood async JS, and that Loop website, if you remember, callback queue, call stack, event loops, so on and so forth. We've learned about callbacks for async JS, and then last week, basically twice we did promises. Once using promises, second time creating your own promise. Surprise. The most difficult thing here, which was this thing right here, is something you will probably not do very often. We've also done HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let me write that as well. HTML, CSS. This is what we've done until now. What I was about to start today was backend, but let's not do that just yet. What we'll do is a little more of front end. What are we learning right now? We're learning full stack development. Full stack development has two parts, front end and backend. We have not done any backend until now. We've done very basic front end. So this part, HTML and CSS, was actually part of front end, but we haven't really used JavaScript in the front end yet, which is what we're doing today. So what are we doing today? This was week 1 to 5, week 6 or 7, whatever one this is. We're learning about DOM, which is basically JavaScript in websites. We have done HTML, CSS on websites. We're learning JavaScript in websites, which is also part of front end. Back end is something we will start from the next week, which is week 7 or week 8. Which one? This we will start from next week. I already showed the slides in case you want to practice that. Today we're doing more front end. But front end mein to React hota hai, yes, that will eventually come at week 12 or 13. So the right way to do front end is actually using React, but that will come much later, or React or Next.js or whatever. Abhi we're doing how front end was done before React came into the picture. So that is around 2012, 2011, when there were no frameworks, or very minimal frameworks like jQuery. We'll understand the timeline of frameworks very soon. But before React came into the picture, which is a popular framework right now, most websites you will see will either be in React Next and maybe in Angular if you're unlucky. But most probably there's no fourth framework in which you'll be writing front ends. We have to do the first two in this cohort. But before we get into these frameworks that make it a little easy to write front end, we'll understand how front end was written before, how the difficult way of writing front end. Okay, we'll kick things off for the people who came for backend. Sorry, today we're learning front end. I was about to skip this, or not skip this, probably come back to it, but someone reminded me. So these are the slides for today. We're learning about DOM, document object model, and more technically a term called DOM manipulation. This is how front end was evolved over the years. Initially, there was HTML and CS called DOM manipulation. This is how front end was evolved over the years. Initially, there was HTML and CSS. So that was when Netscape Navigator came. So that's in 1996, and that's how you would create a website. Eventually, JavaScript came into the picture, and websites were more interactive. What does interactive mean? We'll see very soon when we understand what JavaScript does in a website. But this sort of kept on happening. Let's say I forgot when JavaScript was introduced, probably around this time only. But let's say up until 2010, the only three languages you would use to create websites would be this. We'd still use these languages only, but in 2010, there were some frameworks, actually a little bit before, some frameworks like jQuery or Backbone.js that came into the picture to make front-end development slightly easier. How did they make front-end development easier? What did they do? jQuery also used to come in GSOC. I don't know if it does anymore because no one uses jQuery as much anymore, but it was very popular before React. Before React came to the picture, people would not just write JavaScript, people would use this library called jQuery. But then, around 14, around the time when I joined college, people started to move from jQuery to something called React, which was a new framework created by the Facebook people. And, things sort of migrated to React very quickly. Today, the websites that we use, probably 90% if not more, are written in React. Then eventually, I don't know when, but around 2018, 19, 20, is when Next was introduced. There were a bunch of other frameworks that came in, if you've heard of Gastaby, all of them, doing something called server-side rendering and trying to get over slight flaws around React. And then now today in 2026, the popular ways to write front-end mostly are React and Next, and some people also use Angular. That's a high-level timeline of how things worked. We are working basically how things were before this. So what we're learning today is how front-ends were written like this, even before jQuery and Backbone.js came. These are two frameworks that, as I said, were popular from 2010 to 2014, but no one uses them anymore. So we're not going to learn these in the cohort. We'll directly jump from here to React. But today, we have to understand this HTML, CSS. We've already learned specifically JavaScript, DOM, and more technically, the most difficult thing to learn today, DOM manipulation. That's the topic for today. The topic for today is DOM manipulation. These are the internal subtopics. Would love to know how many of us already know this. Have you already done this before? Do you understand the topics that are written over here? Do you know DOM manipulation already? Yes or no? ये तो most लोगों को आती ही है. We're at 60-40. This class will be optimized for the 40, unfortunately. So I go a little bit slower. If you already know this, if you were here for the backend, feel free to drop off. It is something you have to check off. So unfortunately, I will have to go with this. What I can leave the 60% with is, as I said, Super30 is launching today to start to prep for, a quiz and a project. That basically means start to do Solana development, because that's what the quiz is going to be for. Super30 is a fellowship that I do, twice a year. It's like Google Summer of Code only. 25 people eventually get a $2,500 grant. And there's, 2 months of intense Solana development. So you can prepare for that during this class. That's all I can give you. Do I have any assignment? No, but I have a few issues in Open Router that you can look at. The recent video that I put. I put a bunch of issues at the end of this video. If you go to the end of this video, you will find I said there are some things missing. There's only one pull request over here right now. Someone added streaming. That was one of the things that were missing, but there's like 10 different things that are missing here. Razorpay integration might be one good one. If you want to know how payments are added to a website, you can try to integrate Razorpay to Open Router. That might be one thing I can leave you with. Or there are GSOC organizations that have come out. Feel free to go through them and try to solve those assignments. With that, I am going to dive deeper into what is DOM, the document object model, and more technically, what is DOM manipulation. Should be an easy class for most people. The DOM, or the document object model, is a programming interface for web development, for documents. What is a web document? This thing over here. It is a programming interface for web documents. This statement should become obvious by the end of the class. But what are web documents? This whole thing that you see over here, daily code, basics of DOM, jump to, this I would call a web document, basically a lot of HTML and CSS. And what would a programming interface for web documents be? It would basically mean an interface or a way for me to interact with this. For example, if I click on this pop-up comes up. If I click outside, the pop-up goes away. If I click on this, I go to the next page. If I click on this, I go to the previous page. This is a programmatic interface for web documents. This is an element on this web document. Clicking on it should take me to my next page. This is what JavaScript lets you achieve, or more technically, you can do this by interacting with the DOM. So what is the DOM? It's basically all of these elements. There's like more technical definitions, but the best way to understand it is this document object over here. If I open my console and I write document, I see something that it returns. When I hover over this something that it returned me, again, if I write document, whatever it returns, if I hover over it, notice यहाँ पूरा blue हो जाता है. So it is telling me कि जो document object है, it is everything inside over here. It represents the structure of a web app as tree of objects. It represents the structure of a web app. मतलब जो HTML लिखा है आपने, just HTML वैसे technically, not even CSS, उसका structure कैसा दिखता है? For example, if this is the HTML I have written, you can say the corresponding DOM or the corresponding DOM tree of this HTML looks something like this. For example, there's a top level HTML tag. You can think of that as this root node of this tree, the DOM tree. Inside the top level HTML tag, there are two tags, the head tag and the body tag. So what you can say is कि HTML के दो children हैं, head tag, body tag. The head tag inside has two more children, title and meta. Head के दो बच्चे हैं, and then the body tag has one child, h1. That is what appears here on the right. So every HTML page or a bunch of HTML elements can actually be converted to a tree like this, which is also known as the DOM tree. Why are we learning all of this? इसको पढ़ने का फायदा क्या है? The benefit is कि eventually we need to understand कि मान लो ये एक page है तो this is a page, but this is a very useless page. A more functional page would be a to-do application. A to-do application would look something like this. कि sign up होगा, sign in होगा. Once you've signed up, you can add to-do. So there will be some input box somewhere. कि add your to-do here. For example, go to gym. Show the user a button right below that says add to-do. And when the user clicks on this add to-do button, this to-do gets added to their to-do list. If I add another to-do over here, saying was, if I add another to-do over, hello, my apologies. I think it was lagging. Hopefully it's not lagging anymore. What if I write, I don't know, take class over here and click on add. Twitter is a real application. Zepto is a real application. This isn't really a real application, which is why we haven't yet seen the challenges of a real application. What do I mean when I say real application? I mean कि इस वेबसाइट का जो HTML है for a to-do app, let's say you create a to-do app today and deploy it on todo.100xdeps.com. This website has HTML that changes when a user clicks on the button. Do you agree? मैं इस बटन पे क्लिक करता हूं तो पेज का HTML चेंज हो जाता है. If the current HTML looks something like this, HTML tag inside which go to gym. Second one is eat food. Third HTML file for a page like this should look something like this. Clicks. If I write something like button, I literally added to the DOM. See Daisy, 1 second. Sorry about that. What I was saying was this application only maybe 3-4 posts over here. But as I scroll, more and more posts get added if my Wi-Fi was better. It isn't. But if my Wi-Fi was better, as I keep scrolling, yes, because the HTML is being manipulated. Abhi this page has some HTML. Keep it is something like this. Open any application. Let's say LinkedIn. Look at the initial HTML that I get back on LinkedIn. The initial HTML looks something like this. There are only maybe 3-4 posts over here. But as I scroll, more and more posts get added if my Wi-Fi was better. It isn't. But if my Wi-Fi was better, as I keep scrolling, the HTML keeps changing. More things got added. As I scrolled a little bit more things got added. So is this another website where DOM manipulation is happening? Yes, because the HTML is being manipulated over time. As I keep on refreshing or scrolling, I keep on seeing more and more elements. Does the same thing happen here? Abhi this page has some HTML. But when I click on next, the HTML changes. This looks like a hard reload. It looks like you went to a different page. But in actuality, what is happening is, notice, I'm not refreshing to reach the next page. यहाँ पे पूरा reload नहीं हो रहा है. I'm just going from one page to another, which basically means, as I go from one page to another, as I click on a button, this HTML elements content changes to basics of DOM 2 by 8. This HTML changes from this to this. I can confirm that by right-clicking, clicking on inspect, and exploring this specific button. इसका HTML अभी क्या कहता है? It says basic of DOM 1. But if I click on next, I was hoping it would just show at the same case, but you get the idea. It now says basics of DOM 2 by 8. So as I go from one page to another, notice a few things remain constant, a few things become blue. The things that become blue are the things that are changing as I go from page 1 to page 2. So same page का HTML update हो रहा है. Same is happening over here. When you click on add to do, the HTML of this page changes. We need to understand how, because any real world application would be dynamic like this. अभी तक the website that we had created, if you have created a VS Code landing page or any other landing page, we have not made the page dynamic. We have not seen any DOM manipulation on that page. Now, for the first time, as we today create a to do application, we will see a real application जहाँ पे DOM manipulate हो रहा है, and that is the learning/topic for the day. What is the DOM? How do you do DOM manipulation? How do you create a real website? Assuming React is not a framework yet. When React comes into the picture, things become much easier. But right now, in the pre-React era, to create a page that does not change, for example, that's what we're going to learn today. What is static HTML? As the name suggests, a static HTML page represents that does not change. A page that does not change. For example, if I write code like this, HTML tag, internet is bad. Hello. Hello. Lag हो रहा है. अब देखना, I've changed the Wi-Fi. Is it better? Hello. Is it better? Hello. Mic testing. अभी सही है? ठीक है. Call me again if it is not सही. Okay. Cool. I have changed the Wi-Fi back. Hopefully you guys can see me better now. What I was saying was, the first thing we have to understand is static website or static HTML, which basically means a page like this, जिसके content change नहीं हो रहे हैं. Let's say we have a static to-do list. कि इस पे click करने पे कुछ नहीं होगा. Then it's not a difficult website to code. I can simply write HTML that looks like this. And that would spit out a website that looks like this. Hopefully, सबसे पढ़ा जा रहा है, right? I have one h1 tag for the first to do, second h4 tag for the second to do, a div which has the input and a button. When you click on the button, I don't really care. Nothing happens when you click on the button right now. This is a static page. But should a to do website be static like this? No. If I type something here and click on add to do, it should get added below this second to do as a third to do. If building today, this is not a full stack to do app. What is the difference? Is to do app, how can we do this? This is a pure front end to do app we are building today. This is not a full stack to do app. What is the difference? Is to do app का कोई backend नहीं है. We have not yet learned about Node.js backends, HTTP frameworks, Express. तो this is a what's called a client side to do application. मतलब ये ब्राउजर में चलेगी. You can add to dos. They will appear over here. But if you refresh, आपके to dos चले जाएंगे. I repeat, the to do app that we're building today, this thing is a pure front end to do application. आप जैसे जैसे to dos add करोगे, they will appear. But if you refresh, the to dos will go away because we don't have backend yet. Backend पे जब आएंगे तब हम persistent to do app भी सीखेंगे. How can your to dos persist in a backend? Right now, well, we want to create a to do application, but we've realized the learnings that we have had until this point are not enough to create a dynamic to do application. They are enough to create a static click on a button. A new HTML tag gets added right to DOM manipulation, which it basically means कि button click होते ही वो यहाँ आ जाए. You click the button. Let's say this is my third to do, sleep. When I click on add to do, the document object that I showed in the beginning. In the browser, the document object is a fundamental part of the DOM. It represents the web page currently loaded in the browser and provides there is a web document and in documents object. What do I mean when I say global? I mean, if you write any JavaScript in which you write, something like document, you get access to an object जिसको यूज करके you can insert things in the DOM. Using this document object, you can insert things in the DOM, which is exactly what we want. You can also delete things in the DOM. Eventually, in our to-do application, there should be a trash icon over here. When I click on the trash icon, that to-do should go away. वो भी हमें सीखना है. How can we delete things from the DOM also? If I go from this page to the previous page, what is happening? ये content सारा delete होके ये content add हो रहा है, right? So we need to understand not just adding elements, but updating elements and deleting elements also. To do that, you use the document object. Let's start coding. Let's open a new project in your text.html with I think input element को close करने की जरूरत नहीं होती. I'll still close it. And a button element which says add to do. Is this enough? Of a starting point for a to-do application? It is. If I open this index.html file, it looks like this. An input box and an add to do button. If I write something, click on add to do, वो to do add नहीं होता, which is the next thing we have to do. What are we learning? DOM manipulation. What is the DOM manipulation we need to do? It is, if I write some to do over here and click on this button, this to do should get picked up an HTML file like this. Number two, एक और चीज करनी है. The reason we are learning DOM manipulation now is that now we have learned about JavaScript. We understand JavaScript. वही पढ़ रहे थे हम from the last 6 weeks. So now, just like before we have introduced, CSS files like this, मैं भूल गया syntax हमेशा भूल जाता हूँ, but I think link rel equal to /index.css. I totally forgot. I'm sure this is totally wrong. Type equal to spreadsheet. ये तो नहीं होता है. You guys know क्या होता है exactly. The exact syntax to add a link tag for putting a CSS file here and including its style in this HTML file, यही syntax होता था. ऐसा कुछ होता था, मतलब this is wrong, link की rel की जगह कुछ और होता है, type की जगह कुछ और होता है. But इस तरीके से हम एक CSS file को introduce करते थे. Similarly, now we are going to write JavaScript in our HTML file. Today, for the first time, we are using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we need to also include a JavaScript file in our code base. Not just an HTML file, but also a JavaScript file. I'm going to create an index.js file. I'm going to include this index.js file in my website. I will today write JavaScript. Why will I write JavaScript? To do DOM manipulation. The reason we haven't learned JavaScript inside the browser yet is because we did not have to build a complicated website here. That is why it is a dynamic website. To be able to make this dynamic website, I need to write some JavaScript, and hence I have introduced index.js or included index.js in my index.html. I have not written any JavaScript yet page, but for the first time I have included a JavaScript file. तो ये document object एक चीज होती है, एक global variable होता है जिसका आपको access है. You have access to the document object. You can use this to manipulate the DOM. How we'll see very soon. Before that, I have a very big call out that you need to know about. JavaScript is a language that runs or that can run on both the front end and the back end of your application. A very big call out. JavaScript is a language जो दोनों front end और back end पे चल सकती है. As we create more websites, in these websites we introduce index.html pages, index.css pages, and today we're including an index.javascript page. But in the last few weeks, we have been writing some code. If you remember, fs.read file, fs.write file, new promise, बहुत सारा हमने JavaScript code लिखा है. The JavaScript code we have written until now is meant for the backend or was written on the backend. ये key difference जानना बहुत जरूरी है. JavaScript was a language that was ideally only meant for the front end, was written so that जो भी ये code लिखा है developer ने, ये browser के अंदर चलेगा. If today I go to google.com, the HTML, CSS and JavaScript that the folks at Google have written, Google के जो engineers हैं वो बैठ के HTML, CSS, JavaScript files बना रहे हैं, नहीं बना रहे हैं, Angular की files बना रहे हैं, but let's assume they're writing HTML, CSS, JavaScript files. Whatever HTML, CSS, JavaScript they have written comes to my browser. If I open the network tab here, you will see a bunch of HTML, CSS, JavaScript files. The first file that you see over here is some HTML. ये HTML ही है, head tag है, meta tag है, that Google engineers have written, but is running inside my browser. Inside this HTML, there might be a bunch of script tags. There is some JavaScript written that is running inside my browser. Whenever you write JavaScript code for the front end, this runs on your end user's browser. उसके browser में finally run होता है. This is very different from how JavaScript runs on the backend. JavaScript did not even exist on the backend until 2012. JavaScript was a language used only for front-end development. In 2012, 2012 के आसपास, someone basically extracted out the JavaScript engine from Google Chrome and made it available on the backend. मोटा-मोटा ये मान लो कि Node.js that we have been using until now was actually introduced in 2012. It was sort of built on top of the JavaScript engine that exists inside the Chrome browser, the V8 engine, and someone created it as a framework or a runtime for running JavaScript on your backend. मतलब मेरी machine पे. उससे पहले the only place where JavaScript used to run was browsers of your end users. If I make a website today like Accelerator, my users when they hit accelerator.com inside their browser, browser. So inside, Raman, my friend's browser, or inside, whatever, Kirti's browser, will that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code actually run? Somehow that code will reach the browser and run over there. The browser executes this JavaScript, but this JavaScript, the backend JavaScript, runs on your own servers, runs on my own Mac, runs here. If you remember until now, we've been using this command, node index.js, to run JavaScript locally. We have been using the node runtime, which was actually introduced in 2012. Usse pehle, there was no way to run JavaScript on the backend in your terminal. The only way to run backend was here on the frontend. Now someone has introduced a new runtime called Bun.js in 2022, 2021, whenever they were introduced. Bun.js got acquired by Anthropic, if you recently, So these two are both competing JavaScript frameworks now, or not frameworks, my bad, JavaScript runtimes now. Bun.js can run your JavaScript code on the backend. Node.js can run your JavaScript code on the backend. I can run node-index.js or, bun-index.js if I want. But they did not exist until 2012. 2012 se pehle JavaScript frontend mein chalta tha. Now it runs on backend frontend. What are we learning today? Today we are learning this. How JavaScript runs on the frontend. What is the use case of running JavaScript on the frontend? What were we learning for the past 4-5 weeks? For the past 4-5 weeks, we were learning this. How JavaScript runs on the backend. We were running our JavaScript on the backend and not the frontend. You don't have access to a few things on the backend. You don't have access to a few things on the frontend. When you run JavaScript on backend and frontend, mota, frontend maybe you can write where x equal to 1. Backend maybe you can write where x equal to 1. Frontend maybe you can write something like, function sum a comma b and whatever the body is of the function. Backend also you can write the same thing. So a lot of things you can do in both the places. But there are some things that are only meant for the frontend. There are some things that are only meant for the backend. Can you guess what some of these things are? ये code तो दोनों में चलता है, frontend JavaScript में, backend JavaScript में. But if you remember, backend JavaScript में FS fs.read file भी चलता है. This is what we've learned over the past few weeks. If you write something like this a.txt utf8, then you can actually run this fs.read file function in your backend. If I run node index.js, this file will be read as a content किस तरीके से print कर सकते हो आप. But fs is a module that is actually not accessible on the front-end JavaScript. Front-end की JavaScript में आप user की machine पे कुछ read नहीं कर सकते. I'll also share why this happens, and it should be very obvious why file system or fs exists on the backend and not on the front-end. But something you should know is there are a lot of things that exist on the backend that don't on the front-end. There are a lot of things that exist on the front-end that don't exist in the backend JavaScript. The document object that we just saw, the DOM manipulation object document, exists on the front end, does not exist on the backend. There is no document object in backend JavaScript. If I right click here, click on inspect, go to the console and type document, you saw something got printed. Document does exist in this JavaScript, REPL or whatever, JavaScript file, let's say. But अगर ये मैं index.js में document लिखूं, console.log document लिखूं, and if I run node index.js, notice it says document is not defined. अगर आप node को use करके कोई ऐसी JavaScript file रन करोगे जहां पे you're trying to access document, it won't be able to because this document object doesn't make sense on a backend. It only makes sense on the front end. Front end में ही तो ऐसा होगा कि document object आपको HTML को read करने देगा. The document object will let you read the HTML, manipulate the HTML. If I press add to do add this content over here, document object makes sense on the front end of a website. On the backend, where there is no front end on the backend, there is no HTML, there is no CSS. So on the backend, it doesn't make sense to have a document object. And similarly, FS is something, file system is something that exists on the backend. If I write const fs equal to require fs, and then do console.log, whatever, fs.read file. If I do this, utf8, and if I introduce an a.txt file over here, this will not throw an error. A callback function, but other than that, if I write this code, it will not throw an error. I have not logged the data. If I log the data, I will read the data. But error nahi. But same code, if I try to run inside the browser, it will not throw an error. I have not logged the data. If I log the data, I will read the data. But error nahi. But same code, if I try to run inside the browser, this code, it will not throw an error. I have not logged the data. If I log the data, I will read the data. But error nahi. But same FS will never be available on the front end. It will only be available on the back end. There are a few things that only make sense for the back end. For example, FS makes sense over here. FS doesn't make sense over here on the backend, and document makes sense over here, document doesn't make sense over here. Today we're learning about the document object. The key learning from this section needs to be JavaScript runs on the backend also, frontend also. This week we are learning how JavaScript runs on the website on the frontend. Next week, or up until these weeks, the JavaScript that we have written, we have been writing that on the backend. We have been using Node to execute it. We have not yet used a browser to execute it. Today, the index.js file that we are writing, we will execute this JavaScript inside the browser. Until last class, we were executing the JavaScript in my terminal. When you run it in your terminal using Node, you're running it on the backend. When you run it next to an HTML file by including it in an HTML file, you will eventually run this JavaScript and backend JavaScript. There are two places you can write JavaScript in, run JavaScript in. This place only came after 2012, after Node.js was introduced as a runtime. Before that, frontend was the only place where you could write JavaScript. Backend mein, you can also write code not just in Node.js, but also in Go, in Rust, in C, in CPP, in Zig, so on and so forth. Frontend mein, you can only write code in HTML, CSS, JavaScript, 3 files. This is a nuanced statement, but mostly this is true. Your frontend pe aap sirf 3 languages mein code likhte ho, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Backend you can write code in Rust, Golang, Node.js, whatever, but bunch of other languages. Alright, 95% is good. Now let's understand how are we writing JavaScript in the frontend. Frontend mein JavaScript likhte kaise hain? Syntax wise, it's very close to what we've written until now. But let's go use case wise. What is our use case for today? Okay, if I write go to gym here and click on add to do, this should get removed from here and added here in the HTML. Right now that doesn't happen. Doesn't matter how many times I click on this, go to gym doesn't get added over here. To do that, what we want to do is, number one, add an attribute to this button. Button mein tum kya attribute de sakte ho? You can give style equal to, I don't know, font size 30. Now the add to do button, font size is very big, font size 10. Now it is a little smaller. There is one more attribute you can give over here. On click. On click, jab ye button click ho, then call this function. Kaun sa function? Let me introduce a new function called add to do. What have I written? Kya jab ye button click ho jaye, on click, is function ko call kar dena. Have I written this function signature anywhere? Have I written this? Kya ye JavaScript jaisa dikh raha hai? I'm doing a function call. For the first time, we are seeing how to do a function call on a website. Abhi tak on our websites, we had never written JavaScript. Today, for the first time with this one attribute, we are introducing how to do a JavaScript function call from HTML. HTML pe button daba, to JavaScript ka add to do function call hoga. I have to add this function over here. Now, try to run this without the add to do but function or without the index.js introduced. Then what happens? When I click on this, nothing happens. If I open the console, right click, inspect console, I see an error that says add. So, whenever you are introducing JavaScript in your HTML, try to confirm, ye kya ye chala ki nahi? There, right click, inspect. This is very different from how we were doing logging. How were we doing logging? वो यहाँ होती थी. When I would run node index.js, the console.logs of this index.js would have post that can be called when you click on this button. JavaScript मेरी browser के अंदर चल रही है. When I click on this button, the function gets called inside, which you define, which pops up on the screen. That is the purpose of this alert function. On the front end, exists on the front end, does not exist on the back end. So this definitely confirmed कि यार JavaScript को मैं run कर पा रहा हूँ using HTML. I am able to run this JavaScript function using actually building a website. Today, we're actually creating the front end of a dynamic app, and we can clearly see JavaScript का use क्या है. JavaScript का use ये है, creates a new to do on the pause. How are we doing? Are we doing good? Do we understand sense of the input box? Creates a new to do on the HTML thing. Are we doing good? Do we understand everything? Is the Wi-Fi good? Are we good to go? Lag हो रहा है थोड़ा. Not stable. I will take a pause. थोड़ा सा log है. Little bit is always good. Small pause over here. बहुत lag है. So more lag. Wi-Fi to bad man. I agree. I will take a pause. To the other Wi-Fi. Set good. I'm there. Recording locally in an HD version without any lag. I have added a function add to do. It's the content here. Write code inside this function that reads the content of this input body. Post where this function's job is to actually read the contents of the input box and put them over here. How do we do this? This is where read file. Someone we can use to read the contents of this files easily. And similarly, FS library. FS library exposes you functions like read file. Someone has written it for us to use so that we can read the files easily. And similarly, someone has written a document object that we can use to read the contents of this guy and put them in a variable. To write that variable onto the DOM. To clear this input box. ये document object बहुत useful है. We don't see this later when we reach React, but in the pre-React era, all DOM manipulation is done using this document element. How? It of course exposes a bunch of functions to you. Just like FS exposes a function called read file, write file, read file sync, make directory. It exposes a bunch of these functions. Similarly, the document object exposes a bunch of functions to you like document.getElement by ID. And this function expects one argument. The ID is written over this input box some styling by using this ID. Do you remember this? I can write a style tag inside which I can write hash. You can give, I can write input ID equal to do input. Do we remember it? I can write input. Let me also close the input tag. I can write input ID equal to do input. Do we remember the ID? Inside which here. What I will do is to introduce CSS in our files, which is yaad hai, to attach CSS to that element. Attach ID. You can change. It might have an on-click listener. It might have a bunch of things. ये पूरा जो DOM element है, मुझे उठ के यहाँ इस element variable में मिल जाएगा. Let's see. Let me log that element variable. And let's see what whenever the button is clicked in this element variable, logging it, it looks like this. It looks like a string. It's not a string. It is a full JavaScript object which has a bunch of attributes inside this. It is an object that looks like let element equal to, and when I log this element, you will see the same element here. On this element, on this object, I have a bunch of things, access to a bunch of things. Element dot value. इसके अंदर क्या लिखा हुआ है अभी? Element dot value. I document object in the JavaScript file. If I write this value, it box. Have I written that code? Yes. Is this a little that I need to now run? The next, it hopefully lets me write things as well. Hope बना रहा हूं. इसके अंदर का HTML, the inner HTML, I can change to this to do. क्या एक नया div बनाओ और उसके अंदर put the contents of this to do. So I'm doing something like this. Div, the actual to do, go to gym, and then slash div. I'm trying to create an element like this in this new div variable. अब document.getElement ID lets me read it content the and not that I want. The first to do is see. If I refresh and write go to gym and click on add to do, nothing happens. I am clicking on this, which hopefully means this code is getting called. But it seems like this code is not actually inserting something inside the DOM. जबकि मैं create element call कर रहा हूं. Let's try to call the same thing inside this console. If I can read from this console, I should also be able to put inside the DOM using this console. जो JavaScript में यहाँ कर रहा हूं. Same JavaScript I can run over here. Let me do this. Document.create element. Again, I was able to create div 1. I can actually log div 1 and see a div. But I don't see this div get put over here. Div बन गया, but it only got created as a JavaScript variable div 1. I never actually put div 1 inside the DOM. There are two steps if you want to insert some sort. I can act. तो कहीं ना कहीं when you read this for the first time, it should intuitively tell you कि यार I have not yet told कि ये div कहाँ जाएगा. तो this DOM कहाँ to something like this go to gym. After second script, इसका ID क्या था? To do. This is the foolproof code to do step 1 and step 2. Write the code that reads the content of the input box, these two, puts the contents in this to do variable, creates a new to do element on the HTML DOM. You can actually break the second point down into two steps. Step 1, create a new div element in JavaScript as a variable, and then step 2, insert that div element to a parent div. Step 2 over here can be broken down into two substeps. Number 1, DOM. Finding the element, I see the HTML of the page changes. If I right click, inspect, and go to the elements tab, more divs get added over DOM using JavaScript. The very first use case, the most important use case of JavaScript on the front end, DOM manipulation. This is how you would create a dynamic website until 2012, until 2014, until React came into the picture. Now after React, all of this is hidden from you. React sort of uses this document object to do these things for you. But this was the only way to create a dynamic, something else which is known as a thing would be, insert go to gym and put a delete button next to it. On a real to-do application, you will not just see your to-dos. You will probably see a checkbox over here that you can mark. Or you will see a delete button right next to it. When you click on the delete button, the to-do should get deleted also. The system has all of these to-dos. My original HTML file is still empty. Only inside the browser are the to-dos getting added. If I refresh, all the to-dos go away. We don't yet have backend. We have a front-end only to-do application where whatever you write will go away and the to-dos are available. एक बार website refresh करिए, all the to-dos go away. What was the code for it? This. Finally, some JavaScript that does something useful that helps us create a to-do application. Here it looks very ugly. Yes, we can see how to make it prettier or whatever. That's understand everything until this point. Do we understand? Great. Up it's a delete button right now. Final div looks something like lines of code. Go to this into the DOM. Div slash button. And just write that inside. तो इससे पहले लेते हैं इसको. And complicated div element. New comment. Better way of doing DOM. Append both of these to this div and then append this div to the actual DOM. I repeat that. And not a simple div element. Do you understand the first slightly ugly approach? Let me do a poll. 95% is good. The better way of doing this is create this complicated div element using only DOM manipulation. आप क्या करो? First create a span element. Element span. HTML डाल दो. क्या बच? It will to do button dot inner HTML equal to create to do button tag के अंदर मुझे यही लिखना है delete to do. Sorry, delete to do. What would this do? It would create a button element which says delete to do inside. बाहर. I still need to take it and put it inside this div, which is why the next thing you have to do is to do div dot append child to do button. This line will actually take this to do div and put it over here inside this original div. Now I've been able to create a
as you to
a full div element with the span and the button. This also did the same thing. ये भी वही कर रहा है. I'm not denying this does the same thing. It's actually much easier. But this is not right. Convention wise कह लो. You'll see a bunch of challenges with this कह लो. It's better to create all of these elements individually, append them to the parent div rather than just writing HTML that does everything together. After this div is created, now take this complicated div and put it inside the main HTML DOM. These lines of code will not put this div in the DOM. Finally, जब सब हो जाए, then document dot get element by id parent div जो बाहर parent div है already DOM में, उसमें append child करो इस to do div को. This would actually take this full div and put it inside the DOM. So let's copy this code. मैंने लिख दिया बहुत सारा. Hopefully this is right. Now notice I had to write a lot of code. पहले मैंने to do div बनाया, फिर मैंने to do span बनाया, to do span के अंदर to do डाला, to do div के अंदर to do span डाल दिया. Then I created the to do button, changed the contents of the to do button, again to do div के अंदर button डाल दिया, and then इस to do div को मैंने parent div में डाल दिया. Now if I go back here and do the same thing, nothing happens, which means these lines are taking the button, putting it inside the parent div. This line should append child to the to do div, but the problem is div की id to do's थी and not parent div. The id of this parent div is consonancy and other thing, right? There's a loader here. ये सारा code अगर हमें ऐसे लिखो 11 have we now done the same things but slightly more verbose, a lot of code, line 8 to line 9, a lot of document.get element by id, document.create element, just to finally do something so simple. Adding to front-end development used to be like this up until 2012. जब तक jQuery made it slightly better, but until React came, front-end development was so hard. Now imagine doing this for something like LinkedIn, something like Facebook, where there are so many elements that keep on changing. There's a loader here that now changed to my O. There is some posts here. If I scroll, more posts come. When I click over here, something else comes. कितनी functionality है इस पेज पे? तो बहुत सारी functionality है. ये सारा code अगर हमें ऐसे लिखना पड़ता, if you had to write all of this code like this, things would have been much harder. This is why React is used, which makes all of this much easier. But before we reach React, this is how front-end development was done up until React came into the picture. Do we understand this more complicated way of doing this? Let me. So again, after the pick, div should get delete handler. As for function button that we have added here, ये जो also it should have an attribute called onClick. To do button dot whenever the to do button is clicked, a delete to do function should be called. What does set attribute let you do? On any of these document objects, you can call set attribute to add an attribute to that button. Now it could be a style attribute, style, and whatever, background, color, red. It could be a width, it could be a height. But what do we want? We want to add the onClick attribute that it should call the delete to do function whenever the to do button is clicked. This one line of code does the following: add to do. अब जो to do add हुआ, notice the button has an onClick handler on it also, a function called delete to do. Does this function yet exist? क्या मैंने ये function यहाँ define किया है? नहीं किया है. So right now when I click on delete to do, it will throw an error. Delete to do is not defined. But at the very least, at least the button now has logic to call a function whenever it is clicked. Of course, that function doesn't exist, so let's change that. Function delete to do. Hello, eat food. Let me add calls a when I. तो मतलब ये function call तो हुआ. And then it's a little complicated. हमें क्या पता? There is no intimation inside this function कि const to do index equal to what? क्या पहले वाले का to do delete call हुआ कि दूसरे वाले का? Implement deleting from the DOM. To delete करो. ये function तो call हो गया बस. Irrespective of if it was the first, second, third, fourth or fifth. सब में the same function gets called without any arguments. So how does the delete function know? How can we write logic inside to delete the to do number 1 delete करना है या to do number 2 delete करना है? Ideally, whenever I'm doing a to do call, I should do it with some index. To do number ऐसा दिखना चाहिए. I want to call to do with the index of the to do. First to delete होना है कि second के third के fourth. So what I can do is I can define a global of 1 or 2 or 3 to that specific delete to do function. Then argument is resolve. Once that is done, I will increase to function करना है. First, second, 2. Now the individual button class 2 से call हुआ था मुझे the to do what have I changed? An ID. The first div has delete to I. मुझे कौन सा parent div delete करना है? अगर delete to do 2 से call हुआ तो मुझे इसको delete कर देना है programmatically. अगर this function gets called, this button gets clicked, delete to do gets called with 1. What does my JavaScript need to do now? मुझे delete to do में अगर index 1 call हो तो क्या करना है? I just have to remove the div with ID set to do 1. यही करना है. So what code do I have to write over here? Const. This is how you do document. That's how you read values. Alternatively, I can also do this document.get element by ID to do's. जो parent to do's div है, this div dot remove child div element. This or this both are fine. Just like to the to do's element we can append child, to the to do's element you can remove child. This might be a little easier to digest. This is a little harder to digest, but as you can tell, div element dot parent element will simply give you this one. तो same ही चीज आएगी. आप इसको div element dot parent element से निकाल लो, or you can do this. If this seems easy, we can simply do this one. Let's just go with the second approach, even though this approach will also do the same. Parent element से निकाल लो, or you can do this. If this seems easy, we can simply do this one. Let's just go with the delete to do with that index. Number 2, parent div को you have to attach that end child delete mode. So you will add all value empty for the next. Logic maintain करना was it. When inserting the delete to do should be key to what kind of code will. Did we understand? Not batch elements by the way. We have only learned this document get element by ID, but you can use a bunch of other selectors. Query selector all, get elements by class name, get element by class name. पढ़ लेने को पढ़ना हो तो rarely will you do DOM manipulation because we will get dot r application. First div is this div right here, पूरी application में. So document query selector returns you that. Document query selector all will return you all the divs. Parent divs elements over here, जिनकी ID is set to to-dos. Dot to-dos will return you all the elements over here, जिनकी class name is set to to-dos. So query sends you all of them. Query selector returns you this. Hopefully you can guess what it is, or Google after the class. Okay, what does get element by class name and get elements by class name do? You can guess. एक class वाले सारे elements लौटा देगा. Updating the element हमें समझ आ गया. Set the HTML to something else. Deleting the elements हमें समझ आ गया. Parent element dot remove child with that specific element. Assignment है. मोटी-मोटी हमने कर ही लिया ये. In this case, to do's appear above. कुछ तो अजीब सी है assignment देख लेना मतलब I think there will be better assignments eventually. And we also understood how to create more complex elements. A div which has a span and a span. So slides सारी हमने cover कर ली हैं. Now I'm open to taking questions and look forward to the assignments that let you write more things. For example, one check. क्या if all was like cohort 3 doing Ethereum doesn't make easy Solana? Maybe. Bunch of notion docs. Notion doc number 1. Cohort 3 doing Ethereum doesn't make easy Solana? Maybe. Maybe not too much. Solana is very different. Probably not. Yes, I know, and you should try. For final year type projects, you think better stack or Bible? I don't know. Depends on the recruiter. Probably. Any 10 is a good one. XS is a good one. So Super30 projects काफी मतलब probably half they use they help somewhere. This looks like a complex project, or that is what get gotten into. So pick an advanced ish. Maybe open out can be one, maybe not actually. But even the one that you mentioned is pretty good. Better stack. Can you make any video ideas for DevOps? Sure. So 30 ideas shared, edit and lovable and XS. But I'm happy to make video as well. Will you handle case for React? Handle case for React and be similar? No, it will not be similar. I think the question is, will it be similar? And the answer is unfortunately no. Hosting React websites is slightly easier. Hosting Next.js applications, I'm unsure about Angular, but pretty sure about Angular as well. Maybe not Angular actually. Angular might be similar, but Next.js it's harder. So your Angular, I'm unsure, mostly should be similar. But when you write etc here, so if you add a Next.js over here, no, deploying Next.js app cell, not just for React, but for Next.js or for Express or workers are them, and hence you opt which that's where you do it. This is a good project that you should definitely build. Or I would definitely build. All right. Anything in Q&A? AI and coding view makes system that just building outcome. I mean, for a company to company, some companies make sense to whatever use AI without knowing what's happening. Most companies it doesn't, especially if the life cycle of the company. You downtime is fine. Then React, and if I go back here, we call it here. Sorry for a mild catfish. We ended up doing front end when we were supposed to do back end. You'll find more assignments on this that you should do. You guys are still much faster, like 6 point. Plus a lot of back end was done in the semester, and probably everything until we've done until this point was done people in works. All right, we call it here. Sorry for a mild catfish. We ended up doing front end when we were supposed to do back end. You'll find more assignments on this that you should do. You guys are still much faster, like significantly faster than a complete beginner, which is good. How do I say this? Because school ke jo bacche the, and school mein jo, whatever, first year people after JEE, probably this everything we have covered until this point, plus a lot of backend was done in the semester, and probably everything until we've done until this point was done in like 2 months of full time 5 days a week, and you guys are learning this in like an hour, or like 2 hours a week. So speed is great compared to complete beginners. You guys are not complete beginners or really fast or high IQ, I don't know, which is a good sign. Next week we start backend, and I think in the next 4 weeks we should be able to complete like a semester worth of syllabus at Harnett School, which was backend and JavaScript and DOM manipulation. Then we'll do some projects. We'll probably finish React and we'll do projects. All right, we're in here. Thank you everyone. Bye bye. I'll see you guys Sunday.
Backend engineering is a very wide scope. And when I say backend engineering, it is much more than building a set of CRUD API. Accessing the dead zone nodes. That